السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. تحركوا الآن لوقف الحرب ووضع حد للعنصرية أو تحالف أنسر. تحالف استقطب العديد من الأحرار وأثار الكثير من الصخب الإعلامي في أمريكا، والتساؤلات كثيرة. تحالف أنسر من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا.
There have already been 100,000 people killed in this war in Syria. And they've been killed because our tax dollars.
إذا الشعب يوما أراد الحياة فلا بد أن يستجيب القدر.
We cannot afford to shed more Syrian blood.
هي الشعوب الحرة أطلقت صرخة واحدة انطلقت من كل أنحاء العالم، رافضة لأي ضربة عسكرية ضد سوريا، بل لأي تهديد بشن عدوان عسكري على سوريا. هذه المرة غير كل مرة، فالشعب الأمريكي سئم الحروب العدمية، وضعه الداخلي مترهل من الناحية الاقتصادية وحتى الاجتماعية، لذا صرخ عشرات الآلاف من الأمريكيين رافضين أي حرب أخرى ضد أي دولة لا تمثل تهديداً للولايات المتحدة. الولايات الأمريكية المختلفة اشتعلت بالهتافات والشعارات المنددة بأي حرب على سوريا، وذكرت وكالة رويترز أن المتظاهرين رفعوا لافتات كتب عليها: نريد وظائف لا نريد حربا، وأخفض نفقات البنتاغون ولا قسائم الطعام، ولا نريد مزيدا من الحروب من أجل أرباح الشركات، وارفعوا أيديكم عن سوريا. استطلاعات الرأي المختلفة أظهرت أن أكثر من 65% من الشعب الأمريكي بكل أطيافه يرفض التدخل العسكري في سوريا.
Obama does go into Syria, God forbid. He's not helping America, he's not helping Syria, he's helping Al-Qaeda.
لعل صرخة الشعوب اليوم مدوية أكثر، إذ انعكست المعارضة للتدخل الغربي في سوريا بهزيمة رئيس الوزراء البريطاني ديفيد كاميرون في البرلمان، وأدت الصرخة نفسها إلى دفع الرئيس الأمريكي أوباما إلى الوصول إلى الاتفاق مع روسيا، وبالتالي إلى وقف أي عمل حربي فوري. رئيسة جمعية الشراكة من أجل العدالة المدنية والناشطة في تحالف تحركوا الآن لوقف الحرب ووضع حد للعنصرية أنسر، المحامية الأمريكية مارا في هايدن، ما هو تقويمها للحراك الشعبي في أمريكا رفضاً للحرب على سوريا من خلال نشاطات تحالف أنسر. Ms. Mara Verheyden, U.S. Attorney at Law and Executive Director for the Partnership for Civil Justice and a vocal activist of Answer Coalition. Welcome to the Inside, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome, ma'am. So what can you tell us about the circumstances that led to the inception of this coalition, which is Act Now to Stop War and End Racism?
Well, the Answer Coalition was founded in the days just after September 11th, 2001, when the people of the United States were, of course, terribly upset and really shocked and hurt and frightened and angry about the attacks on the United States. But at the same time, the coalition realized that the government of the United States would attempt to use those attacks for a war drive in the Middle East. And many different groups came together who were willing to stand up and speak out in opposition to using September 11th as an opportunity to then go in and attack other countries in the Middle East. So in the days after September 11th, all these groups came together and they held their first demonstration just within 2 weeks. And no one knew how many people would come because, of course, the United States was in a state of shock. George Bush's ratings, people liked him, were sky high. And yet we had more than 25,000 people come out into the streets of Washington, D.C. to say war is not the answer and to oppose efforts in a new war.
Let's go back to talk about certain kind of goals related to Answer, which is just, the title, which is to stop the war and end racism, or you had other goals?
There is an understanding that we who are in the United States have an obligation to stand up and speak out when the government of the United States, which speaks in our name, does so without our consent. So there was a lot of activity in the United States by the Answer Coalition on behalf of racial justice, women's rights, economic justice, as well as organizing against the war.
Is it just an American coalition, or did it extend itself outside the borders of the U.S.?
The Answer Coalition is a United States coalition, but of course we have solidarity with so many different people around the world.
Mm-hmm. What are the major achievements that you try to achieve through your coalition?
Well, I'm a civil rights lawyer in the United States, and I work with the Answer Coalition, and I have spoken out standing alongside the Answer Coalition. Mm-hmm. And the coalition has organized some of the biggest anti-war demonstrations in the United States since the Vietnam War. In the period leading up to the war in Iraq, they organized the largest demonstration in Washington, D.C. Since Vietnam. There were more than 500,000 people, 500,000 people coming out in the streets of Washington, and they were having demonstration after demonstration of people in the hundreds of thousands in Washington and elsewhere around the United States. And when Answer could see what was happening, what the Obama administration, what John Kerry was trying to do, mm-hmm. and threatening to strike Syria, they immediately mobilized, and they organized demonstrations all over the U.S.
What about the numbers that you mobilized?
There were thousands and thousands of people coming out around the United States. And in mm-hmm. fact, when President Obama gave his speech from the Rose Garden at the White House, and he was speaking outside 2 weeks ago, the demonstration that was organized outside the White House was organized by the Answer Coalition. And the demonstrators were chanting "No War on Syria," and chanting so loud that it was echoing to where the president was giving his speech. And the reporters were reporting that they could hear the chants of the demonstrators outside demanding no war on Syria.
And you know, actually, if we just go back to the polls, the Pew poll or the McClatchy poll, it all indicated that the rates of Obama in power, or how much the people trust him to be in power, has just, you know, went down sharply. And it was because of his handling of the foreign policy, particularly towards the issue of Syria.
The people of the United States, as one could see, have no interest in a war on Syria, have no interest in having the U.S. government strike another country yet again. Mm-hmm. And the government of the United States, which has waged wars of aggression and threats of aggression against other sovereign nations around the world, those are not in the interests of the people of the United States. And the people increasingly can see it, can feel it, are aware of it, and they really made it known. The representatives from Congress who were in their home districts in this period leading up to the congressional vote were reporting that everywhere they went, when they went to the grocery store, when they went to the coffee shop, everywhere they went, they were confronted by their constituents who were telling them, you cannot vote for a resolution for war against Syria. We don't want another war.
That's why, maybe because of this kind of opposition, that opposition came not just from a single party or a single type of politicians, but it came from the Republicans, from the Democrats, from the whites, from the black, from women, from men, from children, from old people, from young people. They all had a one cry, which is no to war, no to military intervention against Syria.
That's right, and across the board, across the political spectrum, there was absolute opposition to this. And congressional representatives, when they came back to Washington, said that while their phones were ringing off the hook about Syria, virtually every single person calling was telling them to vote no for the resolution, and it did cross the political spectrum.
How do you evaluate your experience up till now? Do you think that you've been successful in trying to stop war from taking place, stop the U.S. from waging a war against
Well, we can
Syria?
certainly see right now that mobilizing opposition to a war in Syria was playing a very key role. Mm-hmm. And it was a stumbling block that the administration clearly did not anticipate. Mm-hmm. They, interestingly enough, the President Obama was speaking out on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's March on Washington and I Have a Dream speech. And it was the same week that they were beginning the heavy drumbeat of war against Syria. But of course, he could hardly be dropping bombs on Syria and speaking in the name and about the great leader, Dr. King. And so there was a period of delay in terms of the ability to move forward.
He didn't even mention Syria in his speech.
Well, of course not. But they also then couldn't move forward with an immediate military aggression. And that gave opportunity for an opposition to build. And there was opposition building worldwide, and we could see what happened with the people in the UK. And then at that point, the opposition in the United States was growing stronger and stronger. And it made it very difficult for them to move forward. And then they had to turn and say, well, we'll ask Congress. And then the opposition was so strong in Congress that they couldn't take that step. So now, with the Russian intervention and discussion of a political solution and trying to find a UN solution and a way to address this within international law and within international bodies has really put a brake on the U.S. road to aggression. But we are very mindful that when the U.S. government begins its talks of regime change and begins its talks and threats of military aggression, that while they have been stopped in this immediate path, that we must continue to work because we are worried that they will try and find some other means.
Professor Noam Chomsky, in a recent article, criticizes New York Times Israel correspondent Ruderand, for example, because he says that Ruderand does not tell us that there is a state in the region that has annexed Syrian territory in violation of Security Council resolution and orders, and that has produced and maintains an extensive stockpile of chemical weapons. That is Israel. How extensive, we do not know, thanks to the ban on opening the question.
Well, the U.S. has always been quite silent about the role of Israel's possession of nuclear weapons, of chemical weapons. The U.S. itself, of course, is the only country that's used a nuclear weapon, annihilating people in Japan. The U.S. has used chemical weapons. People are still suffering in Vietnam from the effects of Agent Orange. So for the U.S. government...
They also used it in Iraq.
Yes, of course. And the U.S. government...
uranium.
And depleted uranium in Iraq. And the U.S. government was also quite willing to supply chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war because it served their interests. So we know when the U.S. government demonizes a country or talks about chemical weapons or talks about, dictatorship or uses that kind of language, that's really a pretext for its own designs, because the U.S. has no problem with governments that would otherwise be considered quite undemocratic, so long as the government conforms to the interests of the United States and its own designs, geostrategic designs in the Middle East. And when it comes to Israel, no one is talking about disarming Israel of chemical weapons. No one is talking about addressing Israel's possession of nuclear weapons.
Their justification for this is, their pretext is that Israel is in an area where all the states around it is in a state of animosity towards Israel. That's why Israel must maintain such kind of chemical weapons or even nuclear weapons to have this deterrence power.
Well, they could say the same thing for anyone. I mean, every country that feels that it may be under threat then would be justified in obtaining nuclear weapons or holding chemical weapons. If there's going to be the position taken that there needs to be disarmament of chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, and I think we can all agree that chemical weapons are a terrible weapon, and it's a weapon that should not be used, but there then should be uniform disarmament across the region. And the Israeli government of course, has waged extreme aggression against the Palestinian people and have not been held to account for it.
And they used the white phosphorus, for example, against the Gazans. Right. We will discuss this issue further, but we have to stop now, Mara, for a short break. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود. ابقوا معنا. الناشطة في تحالف أنصر المحامية الأميركية مارا هايدن كيف تصف أبرز النشاطات الحالية الرامية إلى القيام بما يلزم بشأن الخروقات العالمية للقانون الدولي، وهل شن حرب على بلد لا يمثل خطرا على أمن الولايات المتحدة يحظى بأسبقية على محاولة إيجاد حل للمشاكل القومية الداخلية في أمريكا؟
Well, in this instance, with the U.S. government, which very frequently enjoys lecturing other countries about the rule of law, we can see here very plainly that what the Obama administration has threatened to do to Syria, a military strike on Syria, would be a complete violation of international law, of the UN Charter. And indeed, the threats themselves are a violation of international law to threaten aggression against a country which has posed no threat. A sovereign country that's also posing no threat to the United States. And this is a major issue, too, because for the U.S. government to just go around the world to point to a country to decide that it alone has this authority and this power to wage war, to conduct regime change, is completely outside the contours of any ability for there to be an international element in the relationship between countries worldwide. The U.S. simply cannot go in and conduct itself in this way. It's extremely
but they did previously.
And it's destabilizing and it's chaotic. And we can see what's happened throughout the Middle East and the damage that has been caused. And not just in the Middle East. The U.S. government looks to do regime change not just in Iraq, not just in Syria, but in Cuba and Venezuela. It has a long history of this kind of action. But now, back at home, too, for the people of the United States, they're suffering under economic conditions where people are losing their homes, where they can't afford to go to a doctor or take their children to a doctor, where so many families, millions of families, are hungry, and yet there is endless money being spent on war and aggression that, again, does no service to the people.
This is my focal point here, is that, you know, does waging a war against a sovereign country with no posing of threat from this country towards the United States takes precedence over trying to find a solution to the internal domestic problems related to health care, to negligence and failure in certain domestic internal affairs?
Well, not for the people of the United States. I mean, they're highly conscious of the circumstances in which they live and the economic uncertainty and the lack of jobs. And to have the administration, with no basis and no threat to the United States, just announce that they're going to take action against a sovereign country and amass the military against that country. Now, of course, the Obama administration tried to sell this to the people of the United States with that phrase, no boots on the ground. And they kept saying there'll be no boots on the ground, as in there'll be no American soldiers or military physically present. And it's a euphemistic way of saying that all the bleeding will be done by the Syrians, that all the bleeding will be on one side. And the hope is, of course, by telling the people of the United States, don't worry, you will not suffer, that they would be silent. But that wasn't enough, and the people were unwilling to accept that.
Right. As your coalition was accused by the Anti-Defamation League as supporting what they described as terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah.
Well, the Anti-Defamation League has for a very long time in the United States played a role of demonizing progressive movements on the left, of acting with the U.S. government against progressive movements on the left, and in particular any movement that's willing to object to the actions of Israel in the United States. Now, as it happens, many members and many leaders in the Answer Coalition are themselves Jewish and are people of conscience and oppose war against people of the Middle East and stand in solidarity with the people of the Middle East and stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine. But the ADL wants to label any group or any person that's willing to speak out against the criminal actions that Israel has taken, and the U.S. government's use of Israel as a proxy regime for itself in the United States is anti-Semitic. It is not anti-Semitic to stand up against war, against militarism, against racism.
Right. On the Syrian issue, interestingly, the American historian Wester Griffin Tarpley argues, quote, I think we're going to find that the AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, influence has fallen fast and that they've chosen a battle that they are destined to lose. They are trading on the basis of victories that are now several decades in the past. No matter what their power might be, they are running into a buzzsaw. That buzzsaw is the fact that the American people are not just sick of war, but disgusted by war. And also Philip Giraldi wrote that defeating AIPAC starts with Syria.
Well, AIPAC certainly marshaled its forces to engage Congress to vote for an attack on Syria, and they failed. And it really does show the power of the people of the United States to be able to stand up and speak out and to determine the destiny of the country. And that's very much the goal of those of us who are progressive political activists in the United States is we recognize that history has changed for the better as people have mobilized together. I mean, it's also a very important element of what the U.S. government does, just as it is trying to foment division and sectarianism and religious division within a country, within Syria, within other countries, in order to break those countries and to destabilize their countries. That tactic of division is one that's used too with the people of the United States to try and separate the people from our brothers and sisters around the world. And it's an effort to try and keep us from, those of us who all seek peace and a just peace together, from being a unifying and very strong political potent force. But we've shown that in fact we can overcome that.
As a veteran, Mara, and as somebody who comes from civil society networks and coalitions, whatever, what can you tell us about decisive decisions in the U.S. politics? Who cooks such kind, or who cook such kind of decisions, particularly towards the Middle East?
Well, there are different forces, even within the political establishment in the United States, who have different designs. And you also, in this most recent round of the drumbeat of war towards Syria, have the political interests of individuals as well, of John Kerry, who's apparently wanting to run to be President of the United States.
Yes, and he has a big competition with Hillary Clinton.
That's right. And you know, the circumstances here where people voted for Barack Obama, rejecting John McCain, and then Barack Obama is adopting the militaristic view of John McCain towards Syria, was, you know, then rejected by the people. But of course John Kerry was carrying that torch, carrying that mantle, and really speaking in a neocon way towards Syria, towards the Middle East. So there are different political forces within the United States, and as we could see, and as we were talking about before, even when it came to opposition, there wasn't an across-the-board point of view. It in fact was a wide spectrum of opposition across many different political views.
Now, what are the most blatant U.S. mistakes, so to say, and failures committed here in the region?
Well, it's unfortunately a long list. I mean, the U.S. government has decades and decades of overthrowing democratically elected presidents, of infecting regime change, of military intervention, both overt and covert. And the fact that they have been stopped in their tracks with this effort towards Syria, I think, is really an amazing step forward for the ability of the people of the United States and the people around the world to stand up and tell the leaders that if they want to hold the role of leader, they will not be allowed to go forward with these kind of military aggressions and escapades.
Well, Mara, according to an Austin, Texas-based Republican consultant, John Weaver, he said, quote, "There is a growing isolationist movement within our own party," which means the conservatives, that the party's popularity surged in the late 1940s, and he's talking about the time of President Eisenhower, and then all the way up to Ronald Reagan's presidency, which is still revered by supporters for his tough talk against the Soviet Union. And in his 2005 inaugural address, President George W. Bush redefined America's international mission. Now that's changing. I mean, he's saying about the Obama administration. How far is that true? And is America on the brink of the abyss?
I don't think America is on the brink of the abyss. I do think that there is a significant shift in the political climate, and it also comes generationally, as each generation sort of experiences and sees for itself what the government carries out. I mean, the people of the United States are fed propaganda every single day by the major news networks that generally just carry whatever the administration wants to say. They bring on the Pentagon generals, and you know, they'll say anything. And so when people begin to see the truth or learn the truth, they become very active. That's what we saw in the anti-war movement. And it's a major shift within the political establishment when the people become a very strong oppositional force. So the shifts and changes within the establishment of the United States and within the leadership of the United States and which group they're going to demonize at any particular moment is very much part of how they try and manage the population. But when the population is unified and when people are learning the truth and wanting to speak out, then it makes the big difference.
How do you describe the race now going on between Kerry and Hillary Clinton?
Well,
Foreign Secretary John Kerry and former Foreign Secretary Hillary Clinton, they are racing for who's going to become the new president.
Right, both of them want to become president, and both of them looked at the Syria situation as an opportunity to stake out political ground. John Kerry thought that by being bloodthirsty and aggressive, he would stake out ground that would be beneficial to him. Hillary Clinton, however, stayed relatively silent, I think waiting to see what the population thought, because her people believe that one of the reasons that she lost the last presidential election was because of her support for the war in Iraq. So while she, of course, led the charge in attacking Libya, she, in this case, was somewhat quiet until she saw the tables turn against John Kerry, and then she spoke out supporting the Russian proposal. So you can see the two of them basically taking a position based on their own presidential designs and presidential interests. And I have to say, as a woman and a feminist in the United States, you know, we recognize too that Hillary Clinton is going to run for president of the United States, and they're going to try and tell everyone, well, this will be different, this will be better because she's a woman. And I think it's very important for all of us to recognize who care about these things, that she, if you look at Libya, you look at, you know, the positions that she's taken, that doesn't necessarily make her the best candidate or any less of a warmonger than other presidents.
Now, do you agree with the fact that since this, this whole swathe of people in the U.S. opposing any kind of military intervention in Syria, that they would also oppose any kind of military intervention in Iran? And then, consequently, the U.S. administration has to modify and change its strategy towards Iran. And now we've seen that recently, yes, some exchange of messages took place between both presidents, the Iranian and the American.
I think there is a desire on behalf of many people in the United States who are paying attention to international affairs that they want to have normalized relationships where they can with other countries and other bodies around the world. But certainly what's happened with the opposition to Syria and the major stumbling block that it posed for the U.S. administration is a lesson to them. And they're going to be having to think about how they want to pursue their own designs in the future, whether or not they have to have more communication, less war threats, or whether they'll go the route of covert operations more often. I mean, we also know that while they have stepped back from an overt attack on Syria, that they are funding, the formation of fighting within Syria with arms and material. Mm-hmm. So they aren't stepping back at the moment completely from trying to destabilize or cause war within Syria. They are still carrying that out.
Right, civil justice activist, U.S. Attorney at Law, Ms. Mara Verheiden, many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, ma'am. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة، ودائما من الداخل. المزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.